you're ready. Hi, this is an instructional video for the Readings for Diversity and Social Justice 3rd edition book. And this is the following, or the lecture that follows the Act Like a Man, Act Like a Lady activity. So you can use this in one of two ways. One, as a faculty member, you can watch this video and then adapt this lecture in any way you feel works for your classroom, or you can just show this directly right off the RDSJ3 website. So welcome. I'm assuming as I start this lecture that you have already done the Act Like a Man, Act Like a Lady activity, and this lecture is the follow-up piece for that. So, and I'll do a little bit of training of trainers, kind of teaching of teachers. So I'll be talking to you directly, periodically. Hopefully if you show this in class, your students won't mind that too much. So what you should have as a result of the Act Like a Man, Act Like a Lady activity is the list of characteristics of what happens and what it means to act like a lady, and what happens on the outside if you don't, verbal harassment, physical harassment, sexual assault. I don't have those up here because it clouds this diagram a bit too much, but that's what you should have. And then as you look over to the box, inside the box, what does it mean to act like a man? You should have things like tough, hunt, don't cry, play every sport that there is, have lots of muscles, no emotion, etc. So you've got cross your legs, wear pink, be cute, don't sweat, just get dewy. Be quiet, passive, and have a lot of makeup versus tough, strong, and don't cry. And that's typically what comes out of that Act Like a Man, Act Like a Lady activity. I've been doing that for almost 20 years in my teaching, and sadly, the list doesn't ever change. It doesn't ever change. And so what do we know about these lists? Why is this important? The first take-home message from doing this Act Like a Man, Act Like a Lady activity is to recognize that these are what are called socially constructed gender roles. Gender roles, very different than gender identity. These are gender roles, socially constructed gender roles. And of course, socially constructed means created by society. And gender roles are really just that, roles and activities, roles we're supposed to play, activities we're supposed to do, ways we are supposed to be or designed or designated to be in society. Whether that feels true to ourselves or not, they're clearly designated and precisely delineated roles, which is why you can see that there's no overlap between the flower and the box. So the first take-home message to talk about, or for you students to take home with you from this activity, is that these are socially constructed gender roles. That's what you've uncovered by doing this work. The second key point is that they're very easy to identify, but impossible to meet, actually. And that's the kind of bizarre part about it, is it probably didn't take more than 10, maybe 15 minutes to come up with these lists, and yet no one could really functionally live inside the flower or inside the box. No one actually who identifies as a woman in this society could actually say, I'm going to do everything that's in the flower and live a full, complete, whole, healthy human life. And the same can be said for the box. It's so limiting. It's so restricting. It denies human emotion. It denies a whole range of human experiences and says what it means to be a man is just this. What it means to be a woman is just this. And there's only two categories. There are only two options in socially constructed gender roles. So even though it didn't take you very long to generate the list, in our lived experience, we don't fit completely inside the flower or the box. In fact, what often happens is most members of this society tend to spend a lot of energy straddling the line of the flower, straddling the line of the box, so that I fit in enough so I don't get the harassment on the outside, but I'm not completely immersed in the box so that I can live a more whole, fulfilling life. And the same is true for the flower. Enormous amounts of energy straddling the line or staying within some measure of proximity to the line. So I don't get harassed or don't experience violence, and I can try to live a more full life than what's prescribed by these socially constructed gender roles. So that's the second take-home point. The third take-home point is that what you most likely identified as what happens if you don't is tied to violence. And so on the outside of the flower and on the outside of the box are extreme levels of violence, physical harassment, verbal harassment, sexual assault, just incessant levels of violence. And what's really so striking to me about this, to be honest with you, is that many times we talk about violence against women and the ways that violence in this society targets women with sexual assault and other aspects of domestic violence. But really, we rarely do justice to the levels of violence that push men or push anyone to be back inside the box. And yet I have never met someone who was born and raised and socialized in the United States and who identifies as a man who has not experienced some level of violence. And that's certainly true for transgender students. 90% of transgender students in our public schools experience violence on a regular basis. So violence is part and parcel to the construction and the maintenance of these socially constructed gender roles. And it is endemic to the nature of squeezing people into either just this or just that. Because it's not our human nature to be just this or just that. And so violence is a weapon that gets us back into the flower or back into the box. So that's take-home point number 3. Take-home point number 4 is that homophobia is also a weapon or a tool of creating these socially constructed gender roles. And Suzanne Farr, of course, has written that classic piece, Homophobia as a Weapon of Sexism, to talk about homophobia is used to push people back into the flower and the box. And it's such a effective weapon, if you will, because there is so much violence in this society associated with homophobia. It's open season in many states. We've got over 30 states who have changed their constitutions to deny basic civil rights to LGBTQI folks in those states. And so clearly, we still live in a society that is just rampant with homophobia. So it becomes a very powerful weapon to get people back inside the box and back inside the flower. So take-home point number 4 is that homophobia is part and parcel to the creation and maintenance of the flower and the box. Take-home point number 5, if you're taking notes on this, is that consistently, and you notice this in your lists, I'm sure, the female form is used to degrade men or the male form. A very easy example to explain this is when someone says to someone who identifies as a man, dude, you throw like a girl. And that's never a compliment. It's never meant to be a compliment. Like, wow, Jim, you throw like Sally. That's not something that's a positive marker in this society in terms of gender. Some would argue that the opposite is true as well, and yet there have been plenty of moments where if you look at the WNBA, let's say, and you've got a woman playing on a team who's truly exceptional, you might hear some of the announcers say, she just boxes out that line. She is so good at that. She might as well play in the NBA. She boxes out like a man. That's supposed to be a compliment, actually, but the opposite is never true. The opposite is never true. Now, certainly there's times where you act like a man, you throw like a man, you walk like a man, is also meant as a threat to women, saying you're not in the right place, you're not inside the flower as you should be. But it's always true that the female form is used to degrade the male form. It's always true that one of the most powerful threats you could throw at a man is to say you act like a woman. The second powerful threat is to say you're gay or you're queer or you're a fag. And you probably have all of those terms on the outside of the box. And so take-home point number 5 is that the female form is consistently used to degrade men in the male form. The last point I'll make by way of transition, so take-home point number 6, is that these exist in an extreme binary. Like, ne'er the twain shall meet. There's no overlap or even proximity of the flower to the box in this society. Socially constructed gender roles are supposed to be extreme opposites of each other. And so this transitions into the second major point here. The first major point being the characteristics of the flower and the box that I just outlined. The second major point is to show how the flower and the box actually serve as the foundation of sexism and, in a broader sense, gender oppression in the United States. And so, as you can see, we've got this extreme binary, these extreme opposites. We also know that gender in the United States is organized along lines of power, where you've got a dominant or an agent group or a target or a subordinate group. And many of the other readings in RDSJ, particularly the readings in the Conceptual Frameworks chapter, have outlined how structures of oppression work, how systems of oppression work from dominant to subordinate. So this piece, this second major piece, ties exactly in to those conceptual framework readings that have already identified that dynamic. So we know that gender in the United States is organized along lines of power, just as every other social oppression in the United States is. And so notice this, that when you have an extreme binary and you organize that along lines of power, so let's say here's the center point, and you pivot these gender categories in terms of the power that's associated with each category. When you make that pivot, the farther apart the gender categories are, the greater the power differential in that pivot. And so these extreme socially constructed gender roles serve as the foundation of the extreme levels of sexism and gender oppression in the United States, because they are constructed to be extreme opposites. And then when you put power, organize it along lines of power, and pivot, you see that the farther apart they are, the greater the power differential with respect to sexism and gender oppression. How do we know that this is true? We know that this is true because we have peer societies around the world, our peer nations or peer societies, where the gender roles are not as far apart and they are not as rigidly constructed. And what we find in those societies is that there is a lower level of sexism and gender oppression. How do we measure that? We measure that by the number of women who are in positions of power, politically, economically, and socially in those societies. We measure that by things like economic equality and equity and access to resources. We measure that by equitable access to education. We measure that by levels of violence and domestic violence and gender violence in those societies. And societies where the gender roles are less rigidly constructed and where there's less distance between them, we see lower levels of negative ramifications of gender oppression and higher levels of the positive results of gender liberation. We also know this because the opposite is true. There are some societies around the world where gender is even more severely codified and more extreme in its binary or in its manifestation, and we see more extreme levels of sexism and gender violence in those societies. And so we can look around the world and see that the movement along this gender kind of axis here, the less distance there is, the less power differential, and even the greater difference, the greater power differential and the more extreme manifestations of sexism there are. We also know this because we can observe this macro society's response to things that threaten the flower and the box. And so when I say macro society, I mean the large-scale structure of gender oppression in the United States. And so when we see society's reaction to feminism, let's say, feminism is a threat to the flower and a threat to the box. It's a threat to the rigid construction of gender roles, and in fact creates a more fluid gender dynamic in this society. And so feminism is met with extreme violence, ridicule, et cetera, on the macro stage of this society. We can see the same thing for the trans community and the violence that's directed toward the trans community by the fundamental disruption of the binary altogether. And we can see also in society's reaction to LGBTQI folks in that this is also a patently heteronormative. That's a nice word, isn't it? Like, throw that out at a party. It's going to really get you somewhere. A patently heteronormative structure, meaning that she's not wearing makeup and dressing up and performing the flower for other women. She's performing the flower for the male gaze, G-A-Z-E, the male gaze. And so she's not doing this to attract other women. She's doing the flower performance to attract and partner with, and it's assumed spend her life with a man, and vice versa. And so this is a patently heteronormative structure As such, we see incredible levels of violence directed toward LGBTQI folks in this society precisely because it disrupts the intensity of the gender binary and it threatens the system of sexism in the United States. And so to conclude, the two major things that you can take from this activity of act like a man, act like a lady is one, what are the characteristics and the ways that these socially constructed gender roles are created? And how do these gender roles serve as the foundation of sexism in the United States? Now from here you can explore deeper conversations about gender liberation, what would disrupt the flower in the box, what leads to, or what lays out pathways to gender liberation, and how can we as a society, individually and even within your classroom or on your campus, begin to work toward gender liberation in very clear, concise, and step-by-step ways.